right, hello again and welcome to Expansion.Global. I'm your host, Justin. Sitting alongside me is Fiona. And today we have a special guest in with us. We have Michael sitting here, Michael Nguyen sitting here next to us. He will be explaining a little bit more about his business in Vietnam. He was a part of Cyworld, the social media site that originated actually over in Korea. It was launched in 1999 to give you a little bit of backstory and acquired by a Korean telecom company, SKTA, in 2003. Later actually expanded over into Vietnam, and that's why we have Michael over here chatting with us. He was actually in charge of the launch of the business in Vietnam. So to our listeners, please welcome Michael. Michael, we are very happy to have you here.
Thanks, Justin. Thanks, Fiona. It's an honor to be invited, and I'm really excited to share some of my experiences.
So just to start us off, could you give us a little bit more of a background on Cyworld and kind of what it did for our listeners that are over here in the States?
Yeah, so you could kind of think of Cyworld as the Facebook or a MySpace of Korea. And like you said, Cyworld actually started in 1999, so it was actually before both of those, before even Friendster. And a lot of the things that we see in social networking today were, I believe at least, originated in Cyworld. So a lot of things that you see in terms of the way how friendships develop, how you interact with people, a lot of that just started with Cyworld. And so there's actually a funny kind of like a story. I don't know if this is actually true, but it was said that at SK Telecom, Mark Zuckerberg had actually visited SK Telecom once, had seen it, and perhaps that had influenced some of his ideas for Facebook. And so I don't really know if that's true or not, but definitely you can see if you kind of go back to the origins of Cyworld and see a lot of things that they did, especially with mobile and SK Telecom. A lot of those ideas have pervaded kind of Western social networks over time.
Well, that's huge. I mean, Mark Zuckerberg. They say any of the good entrepreneurs are always just building on others' ideas. So when it comes to Cyworld and your operations in Vietnam, what kind of progress were you able to make launching it over there?
Yeah, so we were the first social network in Vietnam. We launched in the fall of 2007, ended up having over 4 million users, uh, and just key partnerships. We did a lot of different things just because of the nature of startups that probably we weren't planning on to originally, in terms of like social media advertising, different partnerships with government organizations. And so that was a pretty interesting kind of ride throughout the 7 years that I was there.
Interesting, and it seems to me, since we chatted a little bit before the show, and before you had gotten into this world, you had kind of been in a gaming sphere. So, what kind of got you into the social media aspect and the Vietnam operation of Cyworld?
Yeah, so before coming to Vietnam, I was working in Silicon Valley in the US at a startup called Red Octane, which later became known for the Guitar Hero video game series. And I got interested in social media because I was actually put in charge of the e-commerce operations at Red Octane, and so was responsible for selling their different products and titles, and going into social media and learning how to market through social media. That was one of the kind of my first interactions with that. So that at that time, that was around 2004 to 2006, and at that point, Facebook wasn't quite truly national at the point. Usually MySpace was kind of your default social network. And so I had kind of this experience of marketing our products through MySpace and really engaging with fans and learning about their interactions with our products. And that really opened up my mind in terms of the opportunities with social networks, how people connect. And so as my time was ending at Red Octane, when I looked at Vietnam, because my family is Vietnamese, I grew up here, but I'd always had this interest in returning to Vietnam and learning more about the culture. And so I thought about this and seeing this, the change that was kind of essentially accelerated by technology. And so I kind of realized when I was looking at Vietnam that this was a culture that was beginning to modernize. And so you would have people essentially living far away from their friends and family as they got older. Basically, because as the economy improved, these opportunities would be available. And unlike, say, for example, my parents, when they went to Vietnam, they basically didn't. They kind of had very light contact with their family. They didn't visit their family until like 15 years later. They would maybe call once a year. And so as I saw this technology become enacted, I just realized like actually we don't have to live that way anymore. And so for people in Vietnam, as they moved away from their family for jobs or different careers, they'd have technology to be able to always stay in contact with their friends and family. And so that's kind of what I saw as the opportunity of social networking. And I wanted to be part of that in terms of coming to Vietnam and seeing how I could help people stay connected through social networking tools.
Your implementation of it in Vietnam came, as it seems, a little bit before Facebook, like what you said. So, kind of, could you run me through maybe any value propositions or brand narratives that you had to launch the product in Vietnam?
Yeah, and so I guess if we look back at Vietnam back then, even to a certain point today, it's just behind in terms of technology adoption versus the U.S. or Japan or even Korea. And so when I came there, DSL, just broadband, was just starting to trickle down to households. Before then, you would have to go to internet cafes and just split internet. So a lot of these things that even in 2006, 2007, I think by that time in the US we had YouTube already, but all that stuff was very, very new to Vietnam. So as a culture, just in terms of expression and people being comfortable with talking about themselves, that was still also very new. And so while in the US, that kind of came as a slow transition where if you said, for example, around in the late 90s, 2000, people started to get into blogs, people started to get into things like Flickr and user-generated content. All that stuff was completely new. And so if we look at Cyworld coming in 2007, and what we were kind of asking people to do in terms of posting and sharing. A lot of those concepts were very new, and if we look at the culture in Vietnam before that, it's just something that was very unfamiliar to most people. And so that's something that for me, I didn't quite expect just because I came from the US. I kind of thought like, oh, if we bring social networking, everyone's going to go crazy, just kind of as it did in the US. And that was kind of a big learning lesson for us in terms of, well, how do we deal with this now? Now that we know that culturally people aren't as ready. They're at a different stage culturally in terms of sharing and discussing things online. How do we adapt to that?
Right, the culture's a huge thing. So, what was the kind of the relationship? I know this company was a Korean company. Was there a lot of pressure on you to implement this in Vietnam, and was there a lot of pushback behind you because you were saying that the culture is just not there yet? We need to wait for the culture to be. Kind of, what was your working relationship with the Korean side of the company?
Yeah, with SK Telecom, everyone when we met, they were great people and they're very nice and they really taught us a lot about the business just from the things that they had learned in Korea. One of the big challenges with SK Telecom is they're such a big company, and at the time they had opened multiple Cyworld startups. So their perspective, and this is actually very common if we look at 10 years ago, where if you had a big service and you try to go to another country, the kind of the dominant thought was that you need to localize that service for that country. And so Cyworld did that. So they essentially created or invested in new Cyworld startups in multiple countries, including the US, Taiwan, Vietnam, Germany, Japan, and China. But if we look at Facebook today, we look at modern services, no one really needs to localize. You just kind of launch in that country, you have some offices, and you may change the language, but really for the most part, you stay the same. And services have been successful that way. But it was a very different mindset 10 years ago. And so working with SK Telecom in terms of the individual staff was really nice. Did learn a lot. At the same time, SK was facing kind of a crisis on their own. They had begun to see their traffic decline. They had been on top for a while at that point. and that's kind of why they were beginning to invest in these startups. And so they actually probably spent more time on some of these bigger markets like the U.S., Japan, Germany, and then compared to Vietnam. And over time, I think there's just so much shuffling in terms of that international team that we actually kind of lost track of what was going on with Cyworld, and in some ways we were kind of left on our own to figure out things on our own, which kind of was good in some ways, but also had some negatives.
Right, definitely a startup experience. Was there anything that you want to share about maybe some of the negatives, the difficulties in the country, or was it kind of what you were saying and the cultural differences compared to the U.S.?
I guess if we talk about like SK Telecom, it's if you have a business partner like that, they can make a lot of great introductions. And a lot of South Korean companies like a Samsung, LG had been big business partners in Vietnam. And so we had been hoping to get a lot of those introductions and key partnerships. But once SK Telecom was kind of focused on these other countries, we kind of were left on our own to kind of figure it out. How do we get to these meetings? How do we talk to people? How do we introduce people?
Right, definitely. What was the monetization like in the beginning? And could you describe a little bit about how Cyworld made their money in Korea, and maybe how that differed from Vietnam?
So in South Korea, uh, yeah, when we started, we basically based everything on them. So we kind of thought that we would operate the same way. And so South Korea, 30% of the revenue comes from advertisements, like branded profiles and different outreaches like that. And then 70% comes from microtransactions. And so that comes from users buying little digital items to decorate their profiles. They might buy digital gifts for their friends on their birthdays. And for a time, Cyworld was the third largest music store in the world, digital music store behind iTunes. And I don't remember who was number two at the time. And so we thought that was going to be the same for us. But we quickly learned over the first year that it wouldn't be that way. And a lot of that came from the culture. And and what I mean by that is in Vietnam in 2006, no one had really ever spent money on music. If you bought music, it's just through a pirate CD shop down the street. Maybe downloading wasn't as accessible just because broadband wasn't as accessible at the time. But for the most part, if you wanted to buy a legit CD, that was very, very difficult to do. And so it was just something that and so if you had this mentality, so it wasn't just for music, but also software as well, where everything that you got was pirated, and you didn't know where to buy something that was authentic, and you probably didn't know what that even meant and why you would want to buy something authentic. And so now you're saying, with Cyworld, if you're encouraging people to do microtransactions, they've never paid for anything digitally before, and so it was. We once we saw that over the first year, we kind of realized that this was going to be a kind of a long process, and people understanding the value of the microtransactions. So we ended up flipping the revenue side, where we felt that we could get maybe 20 to 30% of our revenue from microtransactions, and then the rest we had to figure out through advertising. And so, as part of that, we created a digital ad agency business unit at Cyro to compete with some of the international ad agencies like a TBWA or a Group M, and try to compete to get some of those revenue dollars flowing our way.
Oh wow, that's just the start of it too. It seems like, and then you're in a competitive landscape as this kind of startup in Vietnam. Um, can you describe a little bit more about the monetization between the advertising? Were you guys offering like a pay per click section, or was it more of like the views that were on the sides of the page? How did you guys monetize that?
Yeah, we definitely offered some of that, but we realized that to kind of offer the same things that everyone else was offering and kind of go by the same measurements and KPI that everyone else was offering, then we couldn't compete, because then it would be, oh, Cyworld is kind of fairly no-name company or no-name agency versus kind of an established international agency. And like we wouldn't be able to win at that battle. And so we figured out that we need to offer something different. And that's where our understanding of social networking, connections, and being able to customize our platform for clients really well, really resonated. So an example of that is what we could do is essentially customize profiles, and on Cyworld they're called My Homes. In Korea they're called mini humpies. And we could customize that. And as we listened to the creative briefs and worked with these different brands like a Yamaha or a Pizza Hut, we could better understand what they were looking for, and then customize the KPI and the measurements to really fit exactly what they needed. And so a lot of times with advertisers, they're kind of forced to use, let's say, cost per click or views or things like that because that's what everyone else is using. But if they had an ideal metric, they probably wouldn't do that. They would want a metric that really equates clearly to something of value for their business. And so as we worked with clients and we listened to their needs, we could kind of create those and essentially map our KPI exactly to what they needed as a business.
Very cool. Now, I always ask this question for the speakers that we have on our show because it's one that really interests me a lot, and one that I think can either make or break a business. And that's the question of culture. Um, could you describe a little bit how the team dynamic worked over there, and maybe the working culture of Vietnam, from just experience when it comes into the tech world? A lot of people are younger. And so, how did you manage these people, and how did you get the company up and running?
Yeah, it's funny that you mentioned that in say Silicon Valley, a lot of people are younger, and so when I was working in the U.S., I was able to become like a fairly young manager. I think at 24, 25, and I was managing people up to 10 years older than me. So that was a very big challenge for me. And then when I went to Vietnam, I was when I started, I was actually kind of in the middle of the organization, and it ended up being that everyone else in the organization was younger than me. And so even though I was like 25 at the time, everyone was younger, and I was really surprised like how that could even be possible. Uh, from a culture perspective, one of the key things that I had to keep in mind, and I just realized kind of early on, was that everyone there, they represented the first generation of people who had been working in a kind of a private company organization. So before that, if their parents had been working maybe in private businesses, like they had like a store shop, or they had worked for the government, and there had been so much change in those generations in terms of the war and different conflicts over time. And so for those people, they had no idea what it was like to work in a company. They had never heard about what it's like to work in a company. What is the etiquette? What do you do for your career in terms of career development? They just kind of showed up, and if you wanted to give them guidance, you could. If you didn't, then they kind of had to do something on their own. And so that's very different from the U.S., where since my parents worked here as I was growing up, they kind of gave me advice and saying, hey, when you work, you have to think about these things, and you have to consider these things. If you're applying for a job, you think about these things. And so in some ways, when I was in Vietnam, that was sometimes very frustrating, because I would say, hey, how come you're not prepared for this interview? How come you don't do any research in the company? How come when you go to work, perhaps you need to show up on time or do different things? And I just realized that they just didn't know, because no one had ever there are no examples of this anywhere in their lives. And so a big part of the role in terms of a management role was to kind of teach them this and kind of show them how doing things a certain way by a certain process would really help them long term, but also kind of help the company grow as an organization.
Did you see any fruits of your labor, so to speak, come from that?
Yeah, I think so. I think if we look at Cyworld, uh, and so if we look at tech in Vietnam in general, it was very volatile in terms of the employee migration. So you could have engineers come in, and they would get uh, kind of they would get offers to jump companies for, say, 20%, 30% pay raises, and you would have people jump every 2 to 3 months. And in the U.S., obviously 23, 30% is really quite high, but at the same time, people are also aware of their careers and saying, well, if I jump companies every 3 months for a few years, there's just going to be a certain point where people are not going to hire me, because they realize like this is a huge risk. And in Vietnam, they didn't quite realize that, and for at least for a few years, they weren't being penalized for doing that. And so, but I think with at SciWorld, what we were able to do is just build a company culture where even though this was happening, we had a lot of great people who were being recruited all the time. They believed in our mission and what we were trying to do kind of together and helping each other to really build something together. And all our core staff, they stayed with us for the duration of the company for all 7 to 8 years. And so that's kind of the thing that I'm kind of really proud of, that in terms of just helping to build that culture and just with that core team and really building something together.
Very cool. Now, along the lines of culture too, there's not just the work culture and the team dynamic behind it, but there's also some other cultural forces that are difficult to work around, and that can be government. You were running this company in Vietnam, a communist country. Was there any like government pushback to your style, your work, and if so, how did you kind of manage this relationship with the government?
Yeah, I think as a social network and any type of social community in Vietnam, you always have to be aware of the government. And when I first joined SciWorld and first started working in Vietnam, I had heard a story about a very popular forum, and this is probably in 2006 or 2005, that had grown really well and really didn't take heed of some of the government's concerns. And so one day the government came in and killed him and basically killed the site, and they
that's
never came
that's a
back.
little.
And so, yeah, so that was extreme. But I think for me, like hearing that story is like it's like understanding that you need to take those concerns seriously. And so, for example, if there are certain things that you can't post about, and if the police come by and they want to look at your content or they have concerns, like you can't just say, yeah, we'll take care of it and don't take care of it. You definitely need to have that relationship with them to make sure that their concerns are alleviated, and so that basically you know beforehand, like one day someone's not going to come in and close down your whole business.
Yeah, that's that's pretty extreme. I don't have to deal with that over here too much. Hopefully not just yet. But let me just ask you this before we translate to another section. That company, you worked there for a little while, and it seems like you had pretty good success with them. If you could do it all over again and you could do it differently, is there anything that you would do, and would you do it differently?
Yeah, I think thinking about that more, I wouldn't change anything. I think there were a lot of successes. There are also a lot of mistakes, but just going through that has kind of been a great development for me, and just moving forward. I also think that it's like I think the company ultimately didn't succeed in terms of it didn't become the next Facebook or the next Cyworld Korea even, and a lot of that is like we could go back and say, oh, if I had done this or I had worked a little bit harder or had done different things, maybe this would have all come through. But with different things, I think with startups especially, it's often with the success cases, it's often overlooked like how much luck and timing has to do with it. And I think that with Cyril, we all did kind of the best that we could and really gave it enough time to really try to figure out ways to make it succeed. And I could easily see that under different timing or slightly different circumstances, it could have been basically we could all be talking basically as the Facebook of Vietnam.
Yep. Yep. Timing and a little bit of that magic luck is huge in this world today. But that did give you a lot of experience, as you said. And actually, as you moved forward, you actually founded and were the CEO of Mimo, pretty much the Vietnamese version of Twitter. Is that correct?
Yes, yeah. So Mimo was exactly as you said, was kind of the. It wasn't the first microblogging service in Vietnam, but it was the most successful with over 2 million users, and that was across like web, mobile, desktop. We were basically on every single platform that you can imagine to try to get people easy access to information.
Awesome. So was that the product market fit? What was the where were you guys looking to get into? Um,
Yeah, and so it came after Twitter, and so I was a big fan of Twitter, and it resonated a lot with me in terms of how to access content and interact with people. And I just felt that people in Vietnam needed some of that access, and some of that was because of some of there is some censorship in terms of the press in Vietnam. There is some censorship in terms of information, and I thought this would be a great tool for people basically all over the country, not just in the cities, to be able to access information, and especially with technology emerging like mobile handsets and SMS.
Yeah. So the user behavior that you saw, um, and you said you were a big fan of Twitter. I'm guessing you probably had done a little bit of research on Twitter before starting up the company. Did you see any similar behaviors between the users in Vietnam and the users in the United States?
Yeah, it was very different. So similar to Cyworld, where there was a learning curve and understanding how to adapt that model to Vietnam. And so in Vietnam, what we saw was not many active users. And so in the US, I think even in the US this exists where it's a 20-80, maybe 20% create 80% of the content. But I think in Vietnam, it would be like 1% creating 80% of the content. And so that was a bit tricky to figure out, well, how do we create enough content for all types of people so that when a random person comes on, they can find the channels or the accounts that they're interested in, then kind of stay on. And then also think about, well, if we can make that happen, perhaps it won't be 1 month from now, but maybe 6 months to a year from now, they'll eventually kind of get the hang of it and start to share content themselves.
So was this content creation the main challenge that you were facing? Were there any others within the startup?
Yeah. So content was definitely a huge issue in trying to figure out how do we crack that nut and kind of have enough content to sustain the network. The other side was also cost because, and so I kind of looked at Mimo as a way to distribute content to anyone in the country, like basically instantaneously give this access. And so at the time, and so when Mimo started, it's probably about 2010, 2011. So most people maybe had mobile phones, but they didn't really have access on computers, especially as you got outside the city, especially if you looked at people who are over 30. And so a quick fact about Vietnam is the average age in Vietnam is 27. So it's a very, very young country, even though it's 13th most populated country in the world. And so we had to figure out how to distribute this content and make it accessible to everyone. And so we could do it with mobile apps, we could do it with like a mobile website, things like that. But a lot of people, their only access to information was either TV or maybe mobile SMS. And so we decided that we wanted to invest in distributing information on SMS and try to reach people that way because we felt that we could get a much larger audience. At the same time, the costs for SMS are really high, and they're much higher than if we looked at versus the US. And in Vietnam, all of the carriers are essentially government companies. And so they have a monopoly over those costs, and there's really not much you can do about it. So you essentially have to invest and be willing to pay those fees to be able to kind of disseminate this information, or you can just not do it. And so we decided to go with that, um, and in some ways that kind of drove the economics of the business and made it really difficult in terms of because we were incurring such a high cost, and we were hoping that we could turn around in terms of bringing on advertisers and different things to actually reduce that cost over time. And so actually Twitter did something similar when they first started, but they were much better able to raise the money so that they could pay those costs, and as they became popular enough, they didn't need to necessarily depend on SMS for that distribution.
Right now, Twitter had the luxury of the United States behind them, and maybe some funding in the United States behind them. You were strictly in Vietnam, though. So, how was your funding situation? How did you go about raising funds to do this SMS stuff?
So we had some early angel investment local to Vietnam, and so that kind of got us going. And for most of the team, we're kind of like working on this on nights and weekends to try to get this up. And so that was definitely very difficult. The fundraising situation has kind of changed a lot in Vietnam. It's now much more sexy to invest in Vietnam. But if we look at 4 or 5 years ago, it was very difficult because not many people knew anything about Vietnam. And so you would see these funds in China or around Asia. And if you talk to these funds, they were interested. They said, "Oh, okay, you're trying to do something like Twitter, but for Vietnam, we understand some of these parts, but the problem is that we don't have anyone who knows anything about Vietnam. And so if we think about investing, we don't really have anyone on the ground to kind of look over the business and try to advise." And so for them, it was a very difficult thing to try to put money into the company. So that was a big kind of struggle that we had to deal with.
Yeah, certainly a lot of struggles abroad, but that's why we're chatting. We want to learn a little bit more about these tech companies that are going abroad. That is the goal behind expansion. Do you have any rule of thumbs for any entrepreneurs listening, or anyone that might be interested in opening up a company over in the Vietnamese market?
Yeah, I don't know kind of what people are thinking now in terms of how they view Vietnam. When I think about my time there, and I came back about a couple of years ago, is that I would meet a lot of people who had a lot of energy and come in with some different ideas, but kind of what they thought, they were kind of expecting almost like instant success. Like if I could just bring this and do this for a year or two, it should be able to blow up. But in fact, it's much, of course, like everything, it's much harder than you think. And if you just have this 1 to 2 year mindset, it's very unlikely it'll work out because you're just not used to all the things that are different from whatever country that you're coming from. And so I think that if you're really serious about it, you just have to be kind of have something in mind, to say like 5 years in mind, to really figure out how things work, how to adapt to the country, and then excel. And then if you're able to give yourself that, you have a chance. But if you're just thinking like, oh, I'll just try something real quick, and if it doesn't succeed, well, I'll leave. Well, most likely you'll just kind of waste your time and go back.
All right, a little studying can go a long way, right? So currently, what's your new venture? What are you currently working on now?
Yeah, so I work with a VR game studio. So I'm back kind of in video games. VR game studio called Steelwool Studios. They're based out of Oakland. So basically a group of former longtime ex Pixar guys wanted to get into gaming and they created this studio together and they got into VR a couple of years ago. And so now we're exploring different ways to tell stories as well as do interactive gaming that focuses on kind of their background and pedigree of storytelling, character building, and narrative.
That's really cool. I think VR is going to be a huge success in the future. I think people are just capturing it right now, and I think you're going to be in a good spot, actually.
Yeah, I'm very excited about it, and so it's also something that I hope to see expand in Asia and especially in Vietnam because I see it as if we compare it to mobile, and so most I think developers in Vietnam they're probably focused on mobile or just working in big corporates, but then in mobile and anything that you do in mobile today is essentially saturated, where you really don't have the opportunities to kind of start from nowhere and deliver something that's going to have an impact. But with VR, no matter whether you're from the US or Vietnam or Korea or China, everyone is kind of starting from the same slate. And so I feel like for a lot of people who want opportunity and looking for ways to kind of come in at the beginning, this is it, where no one really knows anything. And so if you have that and you spend some time, you have a chance to really make an impact and do something.
All right, so going off of that, just the last question before we have to call it quits and get going. Uh, After this interview, do you have any speakers in mind or maybe any colleagues that we should interview next? Maybe somebody that has been influential in your life in any way.
Yeah, so I think it maybe going back to Vietnam, I might say someone from IDG Ventures. For a long time, they were the primary tech VC fund, tech-focused VC fund. And so right now, I think Vietnam is a lot sexier to a lot of investments, but they were there first, and they kind of had to go through the highs and lows of a very volatile situation. But because of their investments, and they may not get so much credit for it, but because of their investments, they essentially set up kind of the environment that exists today. And so when I came in 10 years ago, startups were very unsexy. People were asking me like, why would you leave the US to work for a company here? Here as in being in Vietnam, that's not going to pay well, and like, why would you gamble something like that? And so I had to kind of show them, kind of convince them of my passion and kind of talk about the things that we could do together. And some people were convinced, and maybe many others were not. But because of kind of the foundations that IDG laid down with their investments, now when people are coming out of college and now they're seeing some of these startups, and they're like, oh wow, this is actually a valid opportunity for me. And then as they talk to their parents, they kind of getting their parents on board too. And so that's kind of what you need to be able to kind of grow a culture of innovation and hopefully economic advancement over time.
Very cool. Very cool. Michael Nguyen, I wanted to thank you very much for being on our show today and giving us of all of your knowledgeable insight. Certainly very influential and great to hear. Thank you very much.
Thank you for having me, Justin.
No problem. Fiona, I wanted to thank you too for setting up the show, getting Michael on board. That's it for us over here at Expansion.Global. To our viewers, keep expanding. I wanted to give one last thank and shout out to PandaDoc, pandadoc.com. You can automate all of your documents through one click in your CRM. Check out pandadoc.com. That's it for now. Ta-ta for now. See you later.